Hello, hello, everyone on LinkedIn. Nice to see y'all. I see folks from Brazil, Morocco. I see my friends from uh, Toronto, all over the place. Let me know where you're watching from in the chat. Welcome again. Also, anyone in the chat excited about GitHub Universe? If you think this stream is pretty fun, just wait until October 27th. Registration and signups are going to be opening up next week for GitHub Universe, so be on the lookout for that. The whole program is absolutely free this year, but there are a lot of sessions that you can only watch if you register through GitHubUniverse.com. So be on the lookout. Hopefully, you're already somewhat familiar with GitHub Actions, and it's amazing for build, test, and deploy workflows. But today, we're going to talk about an open secret of GitHub Actions. It's also fantastic for automating all sorts of routine tasks, as well as automating compliance. So my guest for today is Philip Halloran, Field Architect. And we've also got Michael Cantu, who's a Field Solutions Engineer, and he's going to be in the LinkedIn chat to answer any of your technical questions. So, if you find any of today's content useful, funny, or cool, or you want to get a demo specific to your organization's context, feel free to use the QR code that I'm putting on the screen right now to book a meeting. So, Phil, tell me about what you're going to demo for us today.
Hey, yeah, thanks, AJ. So we're going to spend about the next 45 minutes or so going through a number of GitHub Actions automations for things that aren't at all tied to build, test, or deploy. So GitHub Actions is great for CI/CD, but what we're going to do is we're going to focus on a number of additional capabilities and ideas to kind of get a little bit below the surface, and we're going to group them into two themes. We're going to group kind of the first set around audit and compliance for a lot of organizations that need to demonstrate compliance in one form or another, to how they manage their work, toward access, all that kind of stuff. And then we're going to switch into a little bit more of issue management and issue automation for folks that are using GitHub Issues to plan their work and to facilitate communication on the projects that they're working on. So I think what the first thing we're going to do is we're going to start from kind of that audit mentality and work our way down. And one of the common things that I hear from a lot of folks is a need to automate some form of audit of who has access to what repository and what permission do they have. That needs to go somewhere. It either gets stored as a CSV, it gets piped into a system. It needs to be shown to an auditor at some point that we can regularly check, yep, these are the people that had access to these repos at this time. And doing that kind of out of the box can be, a little tedious. You'll have to go through each repo, or you've got to build up some automation. But one of the nice things about GitHub Actions is that there are a number of easy to use actions that solve a lot of common problems out there, including this particular one. So there is an existing GitHub action that will allow you to audit your organization membership and report on it. So if I read through here, this particular listing is an action that was created by a colleague of mine out of Amsterdam that I've had the opportunity to collaborate with on a little bit. And the goal here is really, we want a CSV that gets outputted that's going to tell me if I'm part of an enterprise, what's the name of the enterprise, what's the name of the organization, the name of the repo, who's got access to it, and what permission. As I scroll down here a little bit more, I'm going to get to see what I need to do to implement this action. So here's an example configuration for this particular action and some simple workflows. So let's go ahead and implement this now and take a look at what it looks like. So I'm going to jump over here into a repo. This is within an organization, and I don't have a lot going on here right now. The goal of this repository is really just to serve for this automation and give it a place to run. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to add a file, and I'm going to create a new file right here in this repository. I'm going to go ahead and stick it in that .github folder where all of our automations go, and in workflows. And then we're going to go and call it something simple like audit.yaml. And then I'm going to go ahead and pass in all of the parameters that I need. So since it's no fun to watch everyone live type every single thing when we're going to go through about 10 or 15 workflows, we're just going to do some copy and paste magic right here and talk a little bit about what we're seeing here in this workflow file. So we're naming this particular workflow org audit. And for demonstration purposes here, we're just going to go ahead and run this as a workflow dispatch event. What that means is I'm going to get the ability to go ahead and run this on command directly from the Actions tab, and I'll be able to go ahead and see a button and click Run Workflow. In production, we're going to see a lot of folks schedule a cron task. Maybe this will run every Friday, something else like that on a regular schedule so that you can run it, excuse me, on a regular schedule or, whenever you need to. So we've got a job running down here. We've got a job that's called the audit log. It's going to run over here on an Ubuntu machine, and we're going to give it a step called the membership audit log. And really what we're going to go through here is just run this one action. The only thing that I'll point out right here is I'm passing this a token that has audit access to the org. So I have to go and generate a token. I'm going to have to supply that. The standard GitHub token that comes embedded with each actions workflow is not going to have enough scope because we need to go and query the GitHub API for information about the organization and other repositories outside of this one and their membership. So we need to appropriately scope that token. And right now, we're just going to assume that it's a token tied to me. And as we get through a couple more of these workflows, we're going to look at some other strategies so that we don't have to have these tokens embedded that are tied to a single human. So let's just go ahead and commit this right now. And we're going to commit a cardinal sin of Git, and we're going to do that a lot today in today's demo. We're just going to commit right to main. I'm feeling bold. All right, so we've got that in our repository right now. I'm going to switch over here to actions, and we can see now that under this, we have our org audit action that we just defined. I'm going to go ahead now, and we're going to run that workflow. This is what that workflow dispatch event gave me. It gave me this nice little drop down right here where I can come and run that workflow on demand whenever I want to. Let's just jump into this particular workflow as it's running right now and take a look at what's going on. This is a pretty small org because it's no fun to watch this run through thousands of repositories and hundreds of contributors. However, it will do that for you just as well. And if we jump right into the logs here, we can just watch the job happen nice and quickly. And it's going to go through. It's going to find all of our repositories. It's going to run. It's going to start collecting for everything. And it's going to ultimately export the results. So if we go take a look at those results right now of this particular run, I can scroll on down and we can see that it's given us an artifact. I'll just go ahead and grab this artifact and download it. And we'll open it up quick here. It is opening up in another window. So I'll just move that on over into here so we can take a look at what it has downloaded. And I've got a package that's given me both a JSON and a CSV. So let's just go take a look at here. We'll open this up with text edit. And it's always opening in the other window. So if we take a look here, we've got our nice org audit. We can see again, we've got the organization, the repository, the human readable name, the GitHub handle, and the permission for each of the repositories in the organization. Again, we can get that in CSV or JSON. And then from here, we can decide what we need to do with this. This is that first step of the workflow. Next step might be to grab that and upload it into a file server, pipe it into whatever system needs to store that information in your organization to be able to prove that audit out. So that is our org audit. The next thing that we're going to kind of move on toward here is we're going to start working with a single repository for the rest of these actions examples. And from a compliance perspective, there are a number of organizations that have very specific open source licensing requirements. So we want to be able to make sure that whatever open source libraries we're pulling into a project, they are in compliance with our overall open source consumption policy. And GitHub has a number of capabilities directly inside it that'll tell you, using the dependency graph, what are your open source dependencies? We can go in and take a look at what their licenses are. How do we start to build something on top of that that gives us a little bit more robust capability to do something about that information? And so what I want to highlight next is a handy GitHub action that will do some of this work for us. So that is not our membership audit action. We are actually done with that one. And in good fashion, I, of course, don't have this particular one open. So I'm just going to go ahead and look for it right now on the GitHub Marketplace, because that will help me find the page I had intended to show you. So I'm just going to go to github.com/marketplace. My short form here has a type equals actions, or I can just click on actions to filter these down by actions. And I happen to know that what I am looking for right now is a security compliance action. So I'm just going to type in security compliance. And let's see if I can find what I'm looking for right here. Not really finding that one yet. Here we go. This is the one I am looking for. This is our GHAS compliance action. And this was actually written by another colleague of mine here at GitHub. And there are a number of things that, as we read through the README here, there's a nice video, which I won't hit play on right now for the stream, that'll tell you a little bit more about how to use this particular action and what it can do. But as I scroll through here, it does a couple of things. It's going to give me some licensing compliance, give me maybe if I want to set up some policy as code. If I'm running code scanning within GitHub, I can set up some rules around that. If I'm using Dependabot, I can set up some alerts around Dependabot. So I can really start to include a lot of checks on the results that are coming out of the license information being supplied through GitHub, through the dependency graph. I'm going to set up a fairly simple implementation of this, and I'm going to need a couple of things to do that here. I'm going to need a policy file, and I'm going to need to write a GitHub action that uses this particular action right here. So let's go ahead and take a look at exactly what we can do here. So we're going to jump in. We have this demo day bookstore repository, and I want to set a open source license compliance policy in place on this repository. So in order to do that, I really need to do two things. I need to have an open source policy defined as code somewhere. And in this case, I actually happen to have one defined over in this repository right here. So here we have octodemo/pholler and policy. And if I click into this .github/policies folder, I have a default policy in place. And I currently have a license policy set up where we are going to require things that come up as GPL2, GPL3, other, or not available as being against policy, and go ahead and raise an alert on those. So let's go ahead and implement a GitHub action that references that policy and sets up a check for us. So I'm going to go ahead and start committing our workflow file in right now. And instead of going through that path that I've used before, I'm going to use the new web editor experience here in GitHub. And I'm going to do that just by pressing the dot or the period key on my keyboard. And you're going to see us switch over into the web editor. This is basically VS Code running in the browser. This is not code spaces. There is a little bit of confusion sometimes between this and code spaces. Code spaces is VS Code plus an entire terminal, a full developer environment where you can run commands, run your builds, everything in a container. This is just a really nice VS Code wrapper on top of a web editor experience. It still allows me to interact with my repository. So what I need to do now is I need to go ahead and create a workflow file to run that particular check. So I'm going to go here into my .github folder, and I'm going to add something here to this workflows file or folder, and we're going to add a new file. And we're going to go ahead and we're going to call this file something like security policy.yaml. All right. So now I have a security policy.yaml file in my workflows file folder, excuse me. And then we're going to go ahead and grab some content and make sure that that file does something. Copy this right here, paste it in, and then we'll walk through what's happening. So we have our security compliance workflow right now, and this is going to respond to a number of different events on GitHub. So we're going to respond to pushes to the master or main branch. We're going to respond to pull requests into branches named either of that. We're also going to bring up a workflow dispatch just so we can have that click button experience. Then we're going to spin up a job. And here on that job, we're going to use that geek measure/advanced security compliance workflow that we saw before. And we're going to go ahead and just run the main branch version of this. Now, that right here does a couple of things for us. If you're very concerned about policy and you only want certain GitHub actions at certain commit SHAs to run, we can specify a commit SHA after that. We can specify a particular branch of the action if you want to make sure you're always running the main branch. Or if that action has implemented versioning, V1, V2, V3, we can reference the version there too. So we can be very specific about which version of an action or which approved state of an action do we want to run. We're then going to go ahead and pass in a token. Again, this one's going to have that org audit capability to it because we need to go ahead and we need to access a little bit more capabilities that are just present in the repository. And we're going to go ahead and just run a license scan. So we're disabling Dependabot, secret scanning, code scanning. We're going to reference that policy that was defined in that p-holler policy repository and give it the path to the policy YAML file in there, and then tell it which branch to run on. That all looks pretty good to me. So we're going to go now and commit this to the repository. Just add a commit message here like add security policy workflow, and we'll commit that. All right, so now we have our workflow committed. And since this is triggered to run on push, should be spinning up for us right now. So let's go take a look and see what's happening with that particular workflow. We click into Actions. We now have our security compliance workflow running in our repository, and the job has been triggered. So this is going to run. It's going to check all of the licenses for all of our open source dependencies that it finds in the dependency graph and compare them against that policy. And then it'll error out if that policy has been violated. This will allow us, once this runs the first time, to have we've got a problem here. Let's go take a look at what's going on. We've run this, and we have an unacceptable threshold of risk that has been hit. If I go ahead and expand this out, I can see that there are a number of dependency license violations that have occurred when we've run this. And we have a lot of licenses that are being reported back as other or NA. And this is something I'm going to want to go in and take a look at and fix moving forward. We can go back later on to that policy file and add exceptions to make sure that if these are indeed approved open source libraries that we are allowed to use, that they are on that exceptions list so that it doesn't raise this error later. And of course, now that this has been raised, this is a check that we can build in on pull requests to make sure that we're keeping track of open source dependencies on pull requests. I typically wouldn't enable this as a blocking check, but it's a really good advisory one to have in place. All right. So now we have an open source policy check. We have the ability to audit all of our access to all of our repositories in our organization. The next step that we're going to take as we kind of go into this a little bit further is to start setting up some additional checks and policies around issues around compliance, specifically traceability. And a number of customers, whether that are in organizations that might be financial services or heavy manufacturing, have a very strict requirement to have all of changes that are deployed into production ultimately be traceable back to a requirement gathered in some form of requirements management system, whether that's GitHub issues or a Jira ticket or something else of that sort. And then, of course, a common pattern is to go ahead and from that initial issue, create a branch related to that specific ticket, that specific requirement, go ahead and code on that feature branch, and then ultimately merge it back into production. GitHub doesn't have a button right out of the box on that little issue box that'll say, hey, create me a branch to work on this. So we should go and take a look and see if there are any GitHub Actions that might be able to help us out. Over in the marketplace, there happens to be one that I really like. This is the create issue branch action. And this will run either as a GitHub app or as an action. And it's going to let me do a couple of really neat things. As I kind of read through here, I can configure this to automatically create a branch for me on issue assignment. So if I assign an issue to myself or to someone else, it'll create a branch. Or I can pass in a / command to an issue comment and generate that. And as I read through here, give me some instructions on what I need to do to go ahead and implement this. So we're going to go ahead right now and just do that. This will require us to make 2 code changes to the repository. The first one that we have to make is to drop a configuration file for this particular action in the repository. A lot of GitHub apps and GitHub Actions kind of follow this configuration file pattern so that we can just read from a standard location and get the specific parameters that should be passed to the action for this particular repository. In this case here, I'm going to create the configuration file right in the .github folder, and it needs to be called issue-branch.yaml. And I'm going to go ahead and pass in the parameters necessary for that right here. And what we're telling this particular action is we want a short branch name. There are a couple of different formats that we can specify that will include the issue number in the branch. I like the branch descriptions to be pretty short so we can see them and read them in the branch picker in the UI. We're going to give a custom commit message here. And once the branch is ready, we're going to go ahead and comment back into the issue and let folks know that the branch is ready for them. And we're even going to create a handy hyperlink into the VS Code web editor experience so that people can jump in and start coding if they want to. We're also going to go ahead and open up a draft PR for this branch right away. This is a nice little interesting feature as well, because ultimately we want a pull request to be associated with this ticket. This will automatically create that draft pull request. It'll link it for us and keep everything nice and tidy. We're going to go ahead and copy any of the issue labels that are applied to the issue to the pull request to keep them in sync. And then we are going to auto close it if we close the pull request. All right, so that looks pretty good to me. The second thing we need to do is actually go ahead and build out that workflow file to read these configuration parameters and call the actual GitHub action. So we're going to go ahead and add that to our workflows file or folder here, too many F words. And I'm going to go ahead and call this create issue branch.yaml. There we go. And then we will go ahead and pass in our file right here. And we'll go ahead and give this one a name too, just so that we don't have to read files. Top, we're going to call this name. Keep that lowercase for good measure.
Hey, Phil,
Create
sorry
issue. Yeah.
to break your flow, but could you zoom in a bit? Some folks on LinkedIn are
Sure.
having a hard time seeing. Thank you.
How's that?
Looks better.
Yay for screen resolution issues. Okay, so what's happening here? We're going to go ahead and anytime an issue is opened, or specifically it's assigned, or a pull request is closed, we're going to trigger this job. And we're going to create an issue branch for it. And it's going to use that standard GitHub token that comes along with Actions, because we're not reaching outside of this repository to do any of the work. That all looks pretty good to me. So let's go back over here, commit those changes, and we're going to add it, call this the add issue branch workflow. And go ahead and commit those. All right, cool. Those are committed to our repo. So if I come back over here and click on Actions, we now have that create issue branch workflow directly in our repository. It hasn't been run yet, so we need to go ahead and create an issue so that we can do something with this. So let's go here, over here to our issues. We'll create a new issue. We'll call it a bug report. And this is going to be less than informative. So we'll just say, stuff's broken. It's the best kind of issue report to get, right? No details, no repro steps, just, hey, something's happening. We'll go ahead and submit that issue. And now I want to make sure that as soon as somebody's actually ready to turn this into work, that we can make sure that they have an environment set up that meets all of our standard policies for traceability back to this initial requirement, and that we can then turn around later on and demonstrate all of this to any auditor that might want to see it. So here we are with our assignees. I'm going to go ahead and assign myself to this issue. And as soon as I assign myself to this issue, we're going to trigger off that particular actions workflow. So if I come back in here, take a look at actions, and we take a look at that create issue branch, we can see here stuff's broken and it's triggered our workflow. Again, jump in, take a quick look at it. We can see that everything's firing up. It's going to go through there, create that issue branch for us. You can see it's already created a draft pull request for us for that work, and the job's complete. Take a look here at that issue. Now, as I scroll on down, I can see that, hey, there's been a branch for issue 6 that's created. I can open it now in the web editor if I want to. And get to work, jumping right in to start committing to this particular branch. And it's already been linked to a draft pull request for me, so that as I start committing things to that branch, it'll be here in the draft pull request. The nice thing about a draft pull request is that it's not going to start triggering all of your CI jobs and everything else yet. And we can eventually come down here and mark this as ready for review. So now we're starting to get into a little bit more, bit of a traceability, where we now have a requirement that we can define in a GitHub issue. We can automatically create the branch that references that issue put all of our commits into that branch, set up all of the appropriate branch policies that would require code review from certain people, maybe require code review from particular code owners, make sure CI passes and every other check passes before it can be merged. And we have a compliant, traceable workflow that starts with our issue and moves us all the way through to the end. So that's pretty nice. But there is still a little bit of a hole in this right now, if I'm being honest. And that is that there's nothing right now to stop someone from creating a pull request that doesn't reference an issue and doesn't get tied back to an initial requirement. For some groups, for some teams, that's perfectly fine. You don't have to worry about that. For others that have to go back to an auditor and show that every single change points back to at least one requirement, this is a problem. So what do we do next? Well, there needs to be a way that we can require all of our pull requests to link back to something. And in that case, we actually have an action that'll help out with it. So in this one, this particular action right here is for verifying a linked issue. This will go ahead, and this is going to create a check against our pull requests, and it's going to look for a linked issue in it, and it's going to fail that check if that linked issue doesn't exist. And that sounds exactly like what I need. So we're going to go ahead and implement this verification check right now. All right, we'll go back over here. And just as everything else kind of goes, we now know kind of this process. We're going to add in another workflow to our workflows folder. We'll call this verify issue.yaml. And we'll grab some YAML and paste it in here. So now we have yet another check. It's going to verify our pull request issue. Every time there's a pull request to check, and whether we edit it, synchronize it, open it, reopen it, we're going to rerun this check. And then we're going to go through here and we're going to check for a linked issue. And I'm going to pass in one particular check in here that isn't referenced directly in the documentation, which is very important if you're using Dependabot, specifically the Dependabot auto updates. Dependabot will come through and it will automatically create pull requests for you if you allow it to. And those pull requests will bump your open source dependencies when you are to have a vulnerable dependency in your manifest and really should do something about it. And in this case, I don't want those to have to reference an issue ticket. I just want to be able to move forward with them. So I'm going to put in some logic here that basically says, hey, if this pull request was opened by Dependabot, we are going to go ahead and skip this logic. We only want this to run if that actor isn't Dependabot. We're then going to run through, do the same thing, give a nice little handy error message if this thing fails. And so we'll work to commit this back. So we're going to add issue verification. Boom. Cool. So now if we go back here to actions, we have our verify PR issue. Now we have this pull request that's over here that said stuff's broken. And we're going to go ahead and switch this over to be ready for review. Now, when I switch this over to be ready for review, it's going to go ahead and it's going to start triggering off a couple of our checks that we have. So let's go ahead and take a look at those now. Correction, it should trigger those checks. You know what we can do? We can go ahead and go back to our issue and we can actually let's just commit something. So we actually are working with some real data here. So what are we going to commit? Let's go open this in the web editor. This is the joy of a live demo. The excitement we all come to streaming for. All right, we'll go open the README, and I'm just going to add a couple of carriage returns randomly into this. The best kind of edit for demo. And we'll go ahead and return, commit that in. All right, cool. So now if I go back to our linked pull request here, we should have a check triggering off. There we go. Perfect. So now we have our security compliance check running against our pull request. We also have our verify issue check running against here. And we're going ahead and failing this, it's got to be linked to an issue. We need to go back and fix our configuration to make sure this is actually working the way we want it to. If we click into details here, we will see this work later on. There is an issue found. Don't really know why that chose not to work at that point. The GitHub Actions bot. So we'll see this work here in just a second as we move through on, because this is we're gonna keep building on top of this here. So we now have in our repository some basic checks built into place. We're checking to make sure that we have an issue. We'll see that work in a second. We're checking to make sure that everything is going to go ahead and allow us to move through. And we now need to really start thinking about how we keep up to date about communication in here. We've got all sorts of issues getting opened. And I don't know about you all, but subscribing to a repo can get really noisy, especially if it's a really busy repository and I start getting notifications spamming my inbox left and right about every single issue, every single pull request discussion. Things like code owners are great for making sure that I am made aware of pull requests that are important to me or the team that I'm working on. But I may want to keep up to date about topical conversations and issues that aren't at all tied to a pull request without having to go through and read and triage every issue. And so there's got to be a way to make that experience a little bit better. And in fact, there is. So one of the things that is really useful in issues is a good labeling scheme. And we can use a labeling scheme to start notifying us of when people are talking about things we care about. And so there's this issue labeler action right here that we can use to automatically notify teams and or individuals when labels are applied. And that sounds kind of what I'm looking for in this particular project, because I don't want to be notified about everything. So let's go ahead and start implementing this workflow so that we can only pay attention to really what we're caring about here. All right, that's the one that we're not working with right now. This is the one we want. So let's go into here and add a new file to our workflows. And we're going to go ahead and call this, oh gosh, what should we call it? We'll call it our issue auto labeler. Underscores for good measure, since that's what I was using elsewhere. So .yaml. Now we have an issue auto labeler. And I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to define some YAML here. So what are we saying in this particular workflow? Well, every time an issue is opened or edited, we want to run this particular job. Now, this is going to be a little bit different here, and this is something I actually do want to highlight. You'll notice right here, instead of running our issue labeler action right away, I am choosing to run something first. And I'd mentioned a little bit earlier about how we would get into a pattern for obtaining a token that isn't tied directly to a user that you may want to use so that that GitHub Actions workflow can reach outside of the repository and do other things. So you may need to query an API and get results from another repository. Or in this case, we actually are going to want later in our workflow this event of applying a label to start triggering other automation downstream. And if we use that out-of-the-box GitHub token, workflows initiated by that GitHub token right now do not automatically start up or trigger other actions workflows. It's something that's currently built into the system as a bit of a fail-safe to prevent runaway recursion. But in this case, we want some recursion. So I am using this particular action right here. And what this action does is actually kind of cool. It uses the construct of a GitHub app that we've registered within our organization and stored the app ID and the private key as secrets. The action then uses that app ID and private key to generate a token. And passes that token as an output that we can then call down here and pass into our next step. So if we go over into, let's see, we'll just go into github.com/octodemo, and I'll show you what this is looking like right here. Within my organization, if I go down to our organization's developer settings, and I take a look at our GitHub apps, you'll see that up here at the top, I've created an app called the Actions Automator Bot. If I click here into edit, it's got an app ID. That app ID is stored as a secret. We can generate a client secret, store the resulting file contents as another secret, which is what we're doing. Give it a name, but you'll notice down here, there's no actual URL. There's no web server or actual app behind this. We're just using this as a construct to generate the token. And then we can go ahead and use this as kind of a standard approach for this GitHub app, assign it specific permissions so that we're not over scoping it. And then we can install it into the repositories that we care about. Again, really all just a nice way to generate a narrowly scoped token that gets us access to the things we need in our organization without relying on a machine user or grabbing an actual user's token and embedding it into the workflow. So we'll come back over here and get into this. That looks pretty good. There's another configuration file that we need to specify, though, that this action requires. And that is the configuration file that tells us what labels do we care about and who should we actually start mentioning here. Well, this is actually our label notifier. Oops. So we're going to get back to this one here in a second. That is, we're actually a little bit ahead of ourselves. All right, so new file. Hooray. We're going to call this our label notifier.yaml. We'll get to that one here too. So let's see here. Yep. All right, so I am going to go ahead and we're going to create our label notifier workflow here first. And this one is, we'll just go ahead and delete that one. We'll come back to that one here in a second. This is the step I meant to take here first. So what we're going to do is when, in this particular workflow, we're referencing this issue label notification action, which is one I'd highlighted before. Hooray for demo magic and me grabbing the wrong file. Whenever an issue is labeled, we're going to run this particular workflow right here, and we're going to go ahead and notify me. That sounds pretty cool. All right, so let's go ahead and commit this. Committing the proper file here. So add label notifier. Not get ahead of myself. All right. So now if we go back here to that particular repository, we take a look at actions. We now have our label notifier that'll show up in here. Yep, notify users based on issue labels. Perfect. So now if we go back here to this particular issue, we have this stuff's broken, and we pass through that recipient database equals p-hollerin in that workflow file. So what that's going to let me do is I'm going to go ahead and apply this database label right here. When I apply that database label, our action kicks off. Notify issues based on labels. It's going to spin up for us. It's going to run. If it meets the configuration that we passed, it'll apply the label. And sure enough, when we come back here to see stuff's broken, I can now see that, hey, heads up, p-hollerin, the database label is applied to this issue. That's great. Now I can go ahead and start setting up configurations and only be notified about specific things happening in this repository through a direct mention to me or a mention to my team if I configure this to be a team when people have applied the database label and are actively talking about the database. That's cool. That's great. But that requires people to actually use the label properly. And I don't know about y'all, but I usually can't count on that to happen right away. So that's where we want to start automating a little bit more of our life away here. So let's go back, and now we will get into the other issue labeler that I highlighted and accidentally pasted in the wrong configuration file for before. So now I've caught back up to myself, and there's a handy GitHub action out there that will automatically label your issues for you based upon the contents of the title or the opening post. And that is pretty much exactly what I want. I don't want to have to depend upon humans to actually apply the proper label when they open up the issue. I want to let the bots take care of that for me. So in order to do that, I'll come back over here. And as you can tell, because I went through this once before accidentally, we're going to go ahead and add in yet another workflow file to our workflow section here. This is indeed the one that we are going to call the issue auto labeler. Oops, navigate it away. There we go. And this is the one that we will copy in all of this text for here. And this is the one where we're using that pattern that I talked about before, because we want this issue auto labeler to look at an issue when it's opened. We want it to find the appropriate configuration. And if that label exists, or if it maps and it should apply a label, it'll apply that label. And then because we want recursion to happen, because we want the triggering of that label to potentially notify me or anyone else who has subscribed to labels, we need to make sure that that issue labeler or that label notifier action will run when this is done. And that's why we're going and grabbing that token right here through that app-based integration that I talked about. All right, so now we have this, but we still need to actually configure our labeler so that we know what words and terms we're looking for to apply the label. That's where we follow that same configuration file pattern from before. In this case, we're going to create one called labeler.yaml, which is what this particular action is looking for. And we're going to make it fairly simple. We're just going to go ahead and say that we are going to apply the database label anytime an issue has the term database or DB in it. Seems pretty simple enough and should keep me up to speed on the conversations happening about the database that I care about. All right, so add auto labeler. Go ahead and commit those. And then, again, jumping back to the repository, clicking on actions, we can see that we have an auto labeler workflow now. So let's go ahead and open up a new issue. And we will go ahead and open up yet another bug report. And we'll say here, data, stuff's broken again. And we'll just say the DB is borked. And we're going to go ahead and submit that new issue. Now, I have a couple of workflows that are triggering off in the background. The first one's going to go through, and it's going to look for the keywords here in our opening post. And if it finds database or DB, it's going to go ahead and automatically apply that label, which we can see just happened right now. And then the automatic applying of that label is going to trigger another GitHub action, which is going to directly notify anyone who has been set up to be notified, any teams, individuals, in this case me, when that label is applied. And I scroll on down, and sure enough, just now, our helpful bot came in and let me know that someone's talking about the database here in this issue. Pretty solid. We're going to go through one last little GitHub action here that I really like, that kind of really completes this flow. And that is following a pattern of using to-do comments to start automating the creation of all of these things for us. So in this case, what I want to do is I'm going to set up a to-do action. And what this to-do action will do is anytime we use a to-do comment in our code and commit them and merge that pull request, it's going to turn to-do comments into issues. And then it'll follow that same bit of automation that we were working on before. So we're going to go ahead. We're getting here about 45 minutes in, and we're just going to quickly work through this one right now and get it implemented and see how it works. So I have a workflow that I need to add. We're going to add a new file. We're going to go ahead and call this issue from TODO.yaml. Cool. All right. Now I'm going to go ahead and paste in my workflow logic here. And we're going to see here, we're calling this TODO. Anytime there's a push, we're going to go ahead and look for it. It's going to run on latest. It's going to grab that token that we were looking for here, following that same token pattern I discussed earlier. It's going to check out a repository, and then it's going to run this TODO action. Looks good to me. We'll go ahead and merge that in. Add TODO action. Cool. All right. So now let's go through the entire process and make sure everything's working kind of like we'd expect. So I happen to have this stuff's broken again issue right now. The DB's borked. We need to go in. We need to fix it. We need to do something. All right. So I'm going to go ahead and assign this to me. Now that active assigning it's going to go ahead and create an issue branch for me to work in and give me a link off to our web editor that I can jump into and start making the necessary changes. So we'll let that run here. It'll take just a second. And then once I have access to that web editor, I'm going to go ahead. There it is. We're going to jump in. We're already on the branch for this particular workflow run here. And I'm going to go down into my source main Java service. And we're going to go into this book database file right here. And we're just going to drop in a couple of to-do comments that we need to go ahead and we need to implement a full RDBMS instead of just this kind of demo magic that I've got going on here. It's going to have the body of this. We're going to apply the database label, and then we're going to have it open up an issue for another thing for us too. That looks pretty good. This is our generic commit. Go ahead, commit that in. And now our commits exist. We're here on a draft pull request. Our commit has just come in. We're going to go ahead and mark this ready for review. I'm just going to go ahead and, for the sake of time, use some administrative privilege here to go ahead and auto merge this so that we can watch that to-do action happen for us. So we're going to go ahead down here and we will just go ahead and merge our pull request and confirm that merge. All right, so we've merged our pull request in. We've made a bunch of to-do comments. And the last thing that should be happening now, since we've got that push, is our to-do job should be running right over here for us, which it is. It's going to go and it's going to start generating a couple of issues for us based off of notes we've left ourselves in the code that we need to come back to and address at another date. We're going to get a couple of interesting, alerts in here. It's a nice verbose output. And then at the very end, we should have a couple more issues that we'll be able to start sending through our kind of standard work management process. To-do issues done. Everything looks good. Let's jump on over to our issues. There's our issues now for other thing and to implement the full RDBMS. And sure enough, we've got labels that have been applied, and I've already been notified that that label has been applied to keep me in the conversation about the database. So we're going to just kind of wrap up right here, but just to kind of summarize, we've gone through and we've used GitHub Actions to implement a number of useful automations, not at all tied to build, test, and deploy. We've audited our organization's access to different repositories, who has access to what and at what permission. We've set up an open source licensing policy check that'll start creating warnings for us when we have dependencies that are not part of our defined policy. We've gone ahead and set up policies that allow for the creation of issue branches directly from an issue so that we can have that full traceability back to the requirement. And we've also set up a bunch of automation that makes sure that we can keep abreast of the conversations that we care about without having to subscribe to the entire repository, and use that useful automation to trigger cascading notifications, even perhaps, automatically applying the appropriate labels. And then at the very end, used our code and kind of our notes to ourselves in our code and our to-do comments to feed back into that process and create those work items to come back to when in our backlog when we get to them. So I want to thank everyone for kind of just coming out and participating in today's demo day. Happy to take questions that have come in through the chat for anyone that has any right now.
Awesome, Phil. Yeah, you've shown us a tremendous amount of things that you can do with GitHub Actions, and I still feel like there's so much more that you can do with Actions.
Yep, and we're really just scratching the surface here. As if you're kind of wondering, hey, can I do that with Actions? The answer is probably yes. And if you're wondering, hey, has someone already done that? The great place to go is just directly to the GitHub Marketplace. You can click on Actions. We've got over 10,100 in there right now that have been submitted by GitHub, by ecosystem partners like Azure and AWS and HashiCorp, as well as by hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands, of open source contributors who are writing these useful workflow automations to help make all of our lives a little bit easier and less painful when we're developing software.
Great, thanks. And if folks do have more questions about how to use Actions or how it might make sense for what they're doing in their work, what's the best way for folks to get in contact?
So there's all sorts of ways you can get in contact. You can always hit up me on GitHub if you want. I'm at pholleran. Otherwise, if you are actively chatting with folks at GitHub, reach on out. Otherwise, AJ, do you have kind of a generic email address for folks that you like to send them to here as well?
Oh, you can use the QR code that'll set you up to contact sales and book a meeting, talk about things, or you can always ask questions in github.community. That's another good spot. One interesting place where things will be getting really fun is GitHub Universe coming up. I'm going to plug it once again. We've got a lot of specialized sessions on GitHub Actions coming up. So whether it's DevOps or DevSecOps with GitHub Actions, deploying to AWS, infrastructure as code, or even there's I think a fun session on Raspberry Pi image customization coming up for Universe. You'll be able to watch those sessions that you're most interested in on demand, or you can also join in on some live interactive sessions that we're going to be having, but only if you register for free at githubuniverse.com. So lots of fun stuff. Oh, yeah, I also see lots of questions in the chat about whether the recording of this session will be available. Yes, this recording will definitely be available, especially for you folks who have had trouble being able to read the video quality on LinkedIn. So we'll be posting it up to our YouTube channel very soon. I hope to get that up by this afternoon, and everything will be in full resolution, and you can watch the recording there. All right. I think with that should be just about it for today, Phil.
All right. Wonderful. Well, thanks for having me on the demo days today, AJ.
Thanks for joining us today, Phil. We'll see you again soon.
All right. Take care, everybody.
Bye.